I am Irakli, and I work for a group called API Academy. API Academy is this group at CA Technologies that basically does a lot of research in the space of APIs, API strategy, business, design, architecture, as well as, in general, distributed systems. The way we do this research is not in some secluded lab, but we do it by working with a lot of very exciting organizations in a number of industries worldwide, and we learn a whole bunch of things about APIs and distributed systems by working with this organization. So what I want to do today is I want to share with you kind of 3 major things that we learned about managing APIs and how to develop a successful API program. So 3 things about successfully managing API products. Let's dive into this. First and foremost, one of the things we discovered is a lot of people call many different things APIs, right? You can call it just your source code. You can call it old-style web services. You can call it new-style web APIs. When I'm going to talk today about APIs, I'm going to talk very specifically about what we call web APIs, right? This is the thing that kind of emerged with this whole smartphones. This is the way we deliver functionality and data to your iPhone or Android or whatever the favorite phone of the day happens to be. This is not the old school web services that was meant to integrate the part of the enterprise. And there are some differences. And one of the differences that we found, a pretty big difference from the service-oriented architecture web services in an enterprise, is who manages API programs. Like if you look at the successful API program companies, you will see that the groups and the people who manage those programs are a little bit different, right? It used to be that web services are managed by IT teams, right? API programs in the modern companies that are successful with this are usually managed by product teams, right? So you very typically have an API product manager or the director of API program, titles like that, that used to not be around 10 or 20 years ago, right? And that's interesting because if product teams are managing APIs, that should mean that APIs are products, which also is a new thing because the old school web services were largely a support thing, right? You had another product and the web services allowed you to provide some infrastructure that would make that product more efficient or whatever. But we see that very successful companies, people who have really mastered API management, web API management, they actually treat APIs as products in and of themselves. So that's interesting. And obviously, product management is a science that has been around for a while. So there are many definitions of a product, right? So if you go to a business school, they will give you one definition of a product. Actually, also depending on which business school you go. So I had to pick one. I picked a definition from Wikipedia because everything that is on Wikipedia is complete truth, right? Has anybody ever found that? Well, so for what it's worth, it looks like my slides are getting cut off, but that should be mostly okay. So for what it's worth, this is how Wikipedia defines a product, right? It says a product is anything that can be offered to a market that might satisfy a want or a need, right? Do APIs fit this definition? They do, right? There is a customer for APIs. There is a need for APIs. There's a supply of APIs. And APIs can be monetized. This is the interesting part. APIs can be monetized in and of themselves, right? They don't have to be monetized through other products that the APIs support. And somewhat classic example of an API being monetized in and of itself, probably one of the most favorite examples often cited, is this example of a company called Twilio. How many of you know what Twilio is and what they do? So a number of you do. So if you don't, basically what Twilio does is, Twilio is this company that created an API for telecommunications industry, right? If you want to send a text message or receive a call or make a call, you can use Twilio's API, and you don't care anymore which provider you're calling to. This used to be a very, very challenging task, right? If you wanted to send a text message, you kind of had to ask your customer, are you with AT&T or are you with Verizon, or who is the provider? Because you would actually have to write different code depending on which cell phone provider you were sending the text message to or making the call to, right? And what Twilio did, they hid that entire complexity behind the one single simple API. You can send text messages, make calls, and do other things in many, many countries in the world, not just in the United States, by using just a single API. And the interesting thing about Twilio and why it's often cited in the API space is that Twilio actually owns a zero amount of telecommunications infrastructure. Obviously, they have servers and the cloud infrastructure and all those things, but they don't have like telecommunications infrastructure. For actually routing the calls and sending text messages and all those things, they go to backbone providers like AT&T and Verizon. What they did was they created an interface that hit the complexity and the fragmentation of that industry behind something very simple. And they are super successful. This API, and that API is the only product they have, right? It's not like they have a mobile application they power with this API. This is what they sell. They're so successful that Twilio is one of the very few product companies that is so-called unicorn. They're valued at more than $1 billion, right? And usually you see those kind of things with social media, right? With Facebooks and Twitters and the likes, but an API company being valued for more than $1 billion, that's pretty remarkable, right? So we know that you can create an API and productize and sell it enough that it will be very, very valuable. So that's exciting. However, not every API program is like Twilio. So the point here is that while Twilio's example is extremely, extremely exciting, not every API program is like Twilio. You see a lot of APIs that people have developed and invested a lot of time and effort into it, and basically nobody uses it, right? The whole premise of if you build it, they will come does not really happen. And that's very sad because one of the most demotivating things for an engineering team or a product team or anybody building APIs is that you put your passion and your time and money and resources into building an API, and kind of nobody cares, right? I mean, you don't have to admit it, but I'm certain that there are people in this room that this has happened to, right? And I will admit this has happened to me in the past. I'm not ashamed of it. And part of the reason of this happening is because since APIs are products, right? Products have this thing that we have to find the product market match, right? We have to design a product that would be viable in the market. And there's a whole science for it, right? The good news is now that we know that APIs are products, the product management as a science has been around for way, way longer than APIs or the internet, right? One of the first mentions of product management, which is widely regarded as the birth of the product management, is 1930s, right? It was Procter & Gamble. They were trying to improve the sales of a soap, and I don't mean the web services technology, but like the thing you actually wash your hands with. And that's what started the whole product management. And obviously that hugely predates the internet or the APIs, right? So since that science has been around for a while, we might as well learn some things from that science, how to build these API programs for them to be successful, right? So, well, to really learn it, you probably need to go for multiple years of school, so I'm not going to be able to do that here, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you some quotes that I think really describe well what is the essence of product management and launching good products, right? One of my favorite quotes in product management comes from the guy called Dave McClure. He's a very famous entrepreneur, serial entrepreneur, now turned venture capitalist. And Dave says that one of the main things to remember if you want to create a good product, not just APIs, but any product, is that customers don't care about your solution. They care about their problems. And this may sound very, very intuitive and obvious, but we very often forget about this, right? We're so concentrated on the thing we have and how awesome our product is, how awesome our solution is, that surprise, surprise, we sometimes don't ask who the customer is or what they actually want, especially for the products that are called APIs, right? So Dave says that's a grave mistake. That's the biggest mistake you can possibly make. And Dave is not the only person that points it out. There's another guy called Clayton Christensen. You may know him from a very famous book called Innovator's Dilemma. is the professor of business and technology at Harvard Business School, and he spent his entire very long, very fruitful career trying to understand innovation, and not just innovation in startups in Silicon Valley, but also innovation in large organizations, which happens to be a little bit more complex in some cases, right? And he developed this framework called Jobs to be Done framework. And basically what that Jobs to be Done framework says is that if you want to create a product that will resonate with your audiences, you have to understand the jobs that your audience is trying to get done, right? He says that products are just tools. Nobody is interested in the products in and of themselves, but products are just the tools that allow people to solve or to do some jobs, right? So the classic example of that would be if you go to a hardware store. Has anybody been to a hardware store recently? Not too many people. We don't do it too often anymore. But if you go to a hardware store, so for people who raise their hands, let's say you bought a drill in the hardware store, right? What was your motivation to buy a drill? Drill a hole, right? So you were not fascinated by the engineering genius behind the drill. You had a job to get done, which is get a hole in the wall so you can hang a mirror or hang a picture or do something like that, right? Now, this is super important because imagine a big drill manufacturer. I only know Black & Decker, so I'm going to say them, but there may be somebody else. If they concentrate all their effort producing the most perfect drill in the world, right, for the professionals, for the power users, and then somebody somewhere comes up with another mechanism to get the hole in the wall, maybe a chemical reaction. I'm not a chemist, I don't know, but could be possible, I can imagine, right? That whole effort that they put in creating the most perfect drill will be completely wasted, right? If I can get that hole cheaper, cleaner, and easier with a non-drill solution, I'm going to go to that. And that is why it is a very big mistake to concentrate on the solutions and not on the jobs to be done, right? And this is not just a theoretical exercise of Irakli or Clayton or Dave McClure. This has happened over and over again in the tech industry, right? If you look at how many of you have used these big floppy disks that you had to carry around to copy data, right? I used to do this crazy thing that like I would write the same file multiple times because I knew that bad sectors were the commonplace thing to occur, right? So by the time I would go somewhere, my file may not get read. Am I the only paranoid, or did anybody else do it? Yeah. Just wondering. So we had the floppy disks, and then we had the smaller floppy disks, which was awesome, right? And then we had the CD-ROMs, and then we had the USB sticks that can now host so much data that would be insane back in the day. And then recently, Apple has produced this new laptop, the 12-inch MacBook, which basically has no connectors. Like you can plug some things in, but the idea behind that design is that soon enough, all of it will be wireless, right? So the basic job of we need to transmit data from one place to another has not changed. That has been around for 40, 50 years. The solution to it has been changing all the time. So if you're a company who has focused on creating the best floppy disk and never evolved your solution, right, you're probably out of business by now, right? So it's very, very important that we concentrate on jobs to get done and not the solutions we have for these jobs just today. Now, how is this important? Like, how does this relate to anything APIs? So this is a quote of myself. I do this kind of thing. I like to put my name next to the name of famous people. Makes me feel important, right? So what I want to tell you is the way this relates to APIs is one of the biggest mistakes we see over and over again as we work with API teams is using API as a stand-in for SQL, right? They will create an API basically like a HTTP interface to the data they have. Not as a thing in and of itself, but just the access point to the database, right? A more secure access point to their database. And this is a big, huge fundamental mistake because basically what you are doing when you're doing something like that is you're concentrating on the solution. You're concentrating on the data you have instead of asking the question, what is the job that people using my API are going to be trying to get done? Who are these people? You would be surprised, I would even say you would be shocked, how few API teams actually ask that question. Asking, who is this API for, and what are they trying to get done? And if I know what they're trying to get done, how do I optimize my API design so it's tailored to what they're getting done, instead of some structuring my database that was designed like that 30 years ago for reasons that nobody even remembers anymore, right? So this is how it relates to the APIs. We have to concentrate on jobs to get done. And this is not just me saying that this is a big, important thing in the API design. There is Sam Newman from ThoughtWorks, he is famous for his book, Building Microservices, very smart person, a lot of good ideas. And he almost echoes what I'm saying, right? He says that I've seen too often that thinking about data leads to anemic, CRUD-based services. So don't think in terms of the data, think in terms of the capabilities, right? Capabilities, which you will hear a lot in the context of microservices and good API design, is nothing else but understand what jobs your customers are trying to get done. Right? So that is the big lesson number one in creating successful API programs. Do not assume that your APIs is your data. APIs are not your data. APIs are products in and of themselves. Design and treat them like that. Okay, so we're through the first lesson, two to go, right? The lesson number 2 is about API governance. So the thing is, we kind of knew how the governance works in the web services scene, right? If we look at this whole enterprise space and the WS stack and all of that stuff, there were a lot of guidance about how governance works in that space. When we move to a more agile, more adaptable, more free-formed web APIs and mobility space, some of the techniques or the approaches we had for the governance didn't end up working too well, right? So a lot of times the question we get asked is, what is the good way to do governance for the web APIs, for the mobile APIs? And the way I would suggest to think about it is to continue the thinking in terms of APIs are products. So what happens when you have a lot of products? You get a marketplace, right? And then if you have multiple marketplaces of APIs as products within your organization, or as you're dealing with your business partners who may also have their own marketplaces of APIs, a lot of marketplaces form typically economy, right? So in a sense, API governance, the way you should think about the governance in that space and managing the chaos of a lot of APIs emerging, is looking at it as an economy, right? And as my friend Marc Andreessen likes to say, economies and markets are not something that happens to you. Economies, it's not like weather, right? It's something that you design. And you can look for the properties you want those markets and economies to have, and you can design it so that they exhibit those properties. But one of the things about economies is, much like products, economics is a science that hugely predates internet and the APIs, right? So likewise, we can learn something from the science of economy if we want to manage the ecosystem of APIs effectively. And one of the things we know about economy, and I'm not a trained economist, I've taken some classes as part of my business school, but one of the things we know about economies is that centrally planned economies do not scale, right? We had a very unfortunate example of it. I know a little bit about it. I was actually born in that country, the red, horrible, evil country. But one of the things we know is that that economy didn't scale, right? The centrally planned economy is not sustainable. They found out about it. And that very much relates to your API economy as well. If you try to put a lot of control on your ecosystem of APIs, right? If you work for a very large organization that has hundreds of APIs, if you work in the industry or the community where there are a lot of APIs, and if you establish these governance bodies, right? The API review board that has to vet every API that goes into production. People do it all the time, right? This is not crazy. You will basically kill all of the innovation in your organization or community that you were trying to empower by your API program. It will backfire. It is a very bad thing to do, right? And one of the reasons it is like that is because the centrally managed economy thing just does not work. You have to give enough freedom to that marketplace of APIs for it to flourish, for it to be innovative, for new products to come to the market. Now, this is a scary thought, right? Because as a senior manager or the enterprise architect or a leadership role of any kind in an organization, it's very uncomfortable to make peace with this idea, right? To think about, oh, I'm going to just let the teams create their APIs, and there's duplication or horribly designed APIs, somehow that's okay, right? That's a very scary thought. But one thing we need to realize is free market economy in most developed capitalistic countries does not necessarily mean that everything is free. It also does not mean that every aspect of that community or that country is managed by the market forces, right? We actually have something called government in any country, right? There is a whole libertarian thinking about it that maybe there should not be, but until there is a successful libertarian country that we can refer to, the model we know in most well-doing countries is that these countries have things that are centralized and that are managed as a public good, and then everything else is in the market. And another very important thing to keep in mind that the choices of what should be centrally managed and tightly controlled versus what should be in the marketplace, those choices have been made very differently from one community to another, right? So in the United States, the penitentiary system, prisons and jails, is to a large extent a commercial entity, right? It's a marketplace. There are a lot of countries in the world where that's an insane idea, right? You're going to let the criminals be managed by a commercial entity? Oh my God, the whole thing is going to explode, right? And there are many, many examples of this, of different communities making different decisions on what they want to put in the marketplace. Healthcare is another example, what they don't want to put in the marketplace. So as an enterprise architect, as a director of product management, whoever is making this decision or the group that is making this decision have a lot of freedom to work with your community to decide what you want to keep tightly controlled and what do you want to be in the marketplace of the APIs. It is your decision. You design it so that then your organization exhibits the properties that you want it to exhibit. Right? It's your call. So you still have a lot of control. But what you shouldn't be doing is putting everything under tight control. Right? Most things, I would even argue that by default, every API, there should be style guides and the best practices and all those things. But by default, you should assume that every API is in the free market. And then you are going to have very few APIs that are kind of like your military and your police and other things that you feel that you keep tightly controlled, that you keep centralized, and that may go through a very strict, stringent review process. Right? It's a design choice. It's not all or nothing thing. So that is the lesson number 2, that API governance is more effective when it leverages free market forces, avoiding centrally enforced chokehold. And I chose that word very, very carefully. I don't just throw it around. If you try to have very stringent controls over your API ecosystem, it will become a chokehold, right? It will kill all of your innovation. So that's lesson number 2. And lesson number 3 is one of my favorites. It has to do with this concept called unbundling. How many of you are familiar with the concept of unbundling? Awesome. Well, we have one person. If you leave the room, I'm not going to be offended, but I would not want you to do that. But I get to tell you something. I'm very excited. Unbundling is this concept that I think has very fundamental role in the current technology space and the way our business industry is evolving, the way we do business, and it also has a lot to do with some of the latest developments like the microservices trend and other trends. I feel it all come from this very business-oriented concept of unbundling. It's not a concept that I came up with, and as a matter of fact, the way I would like to explain to you is using an example by Marc Andreessen. How many of you know who Marc Andreessen is? Okay, so a whole bunch of you know. If you don't, Marc Andreessen is a famous entrepreneur VC. He got his fame as one of the founders of Netscape, which was first, I would say, the first really good browser for the internet, so really contributed to the success of the internet. And Netscape was not very commercially viable. At the very point when they were going to go bankrupt, they were saved by the buyout from AOL. Right? AOL used to be this awesome company. They would buy the companies that were about to die. So thanks to AOL for that, but that let Marc make a lot of money. He became very rich from that. And then he used that money to become a VC. And I would argue that as big of a role as Marc Andreessen has had in helping launch internet, he probably had even bigger impact once he became the VC, because he has helped much longer list of the internet companies, iconic internet companies that we almost identify as that's the internet. And this is a very short list. The list of investments of Andreessen Horowitz is way longer. I just put a small representative list of the companies that they have invested in. And this is an interesting list because you can see how well they are doing their investing. Right? They have been part of all of these huge successes. So something tells me that a person like that would have a very keen understanding of how current technology and current business works. And that is important because in one of those rare moments when successful people share their insights with us, Marc Andreessen has said that unbundling is the secret formula that he uses to make investment decisions that has helped him be very successful. So we might as well learn something from that, right? So Marc describes unbundling as a pattern that he loves to fund, which is basically unbundle X from Y, but then use the liberation of X as the leverage to do amazing new things with X. We'll go through each part of this definition to understand better what that means, but one thing I want you to pay attention to is unbundling is not decoupling. It's not just separating two things. It's very intentionally separating a smaller thing from a larger thing with a very specific goal of using that separation to innovate on the smaller thing. Right? Let's see what that means in reality. And the example that Marc gives to illustrate how this works is the kind of the history of internet, how internet evolved. So he starts by talking about AOL versus Yahoo, right? So if you remember the early days of the internet, AOL was kind of the internet, right? They provided both the dial-up connection to the internet, and once you get connected to the internet, they also try to provide every single service that you could possibly want from the internet, right? So they were your connection to the internet. They had the portal that gave you all the services. They even had, do you guys remember that they had their own browser, right? It was horrible. I hated it. But they had their own browser, right? So they tried to be the internet. And then Yahoo came by, and Yahoo said, you know what? We're not really interested in that. First of all, there is now this DSL and other things, other technologies to connect to the internet coming by. It's not just about dial-up. So we want to unbundle the services part from what AOL is doing, but you connect to the internet any way you want, and you use any browser you want. So they unbundled the portal thing from the AOL is the internet thing, and they became very, very successful. And then Google came by, and Google said, you know what, this whole portal thing is kind of cool. There was actually a time when portals were cool, right? And that's okay. This portal thing is very cool, but we really don't care about all of those things that Yahoo is doing. We think we can do a way better job at just discovery of the content part, which Yahoo was also doing, right? But Google said, we will unbundle that from the many, many things Yahoo is doing, and we're going to do way better job at that. And then they did it. And once Google did it, we have to pay attention that Google is not a search engine company anymore, right? In business circles, nobody is describing Google as search engine company. It's largely known as an advertising company, right? So Google didn't just unbundle search and called it a day, right? They used that liberation of, they just concentrated on the search part to create amazing new things like AdSense and the kind of advertising that was pretty much unheard of before Google, right? So they used this liberation that Marc Andreessen is talking about to create new amazing things on top of the initially unbundled small thing, right? So that is very, very important. And then as Google became very successful, Facebook came by. And Facebook said, you know, Google did a really amazing job at search, but we feel like you shouldn't be finding people the way you're finding the recipes and the cat photos on the internet, right? So they unbundled people search from just generic, we're searching anything, right? People connections. And once they unbundled the people search, then they used that liberation to innovate on top of it, and they created this whole new concept of social network, right? And once they were done with that whole innovation on top of liberation, basically the three biggest features that Facebook has now is the sharing of the content, the stream of content, right? It's the chat, and it's the image sharing. These are the three major things that people use Facebook for. And all of those three features were eventually unbundled by Twitter, Instagram, and WhatsApp. Right? So once you become successful, people come and attack you, and they try to unbundle you just the way you unbundled everybody else. Now, Facebook's example is the most interesting to me, and this is why. Because I think Facebook, in this history of the internet, as told by Andreessen through the lens of unbundling, Facebook's example is the first one when actually the company being unbundled knew what was going on. Like I think that AOL had no idea what Yahoo was doing to it. Yahoo might have had a sense that Google is trying to disrupt them, but I'm sure it was not called unbundling, and that's not how it was viewed. I would argue that Facebook, and not just me, but Marc is also arguing it, Facebook was the first company in this history that actually knew that unbundling was going on. And what Instagram and WhatsApp and Twitter are doing is unbundling the features from Facebook. And we have evidence for it, right? Aside from the words of Marc Andreessen, the evidence we have that Facebook knew what was going on was the acquisitions that Facebook completed, right? We all remember probably the insane amounts of money that Facebook paid for Instagram, right? When they paid $1 billion for the company that had zero revenue, right? Forget about profits, zero revenue. We all thought that they were completely crazy. Well, I thought that they were completely crazy. Maybe you didn't. So we were not even done being shocked by how much they paid for Instagram, that very, very soon they paid up to $20 billion for WhatsApp. Right? If $1 billion for Instagram was not enough, it became a $20 billion acquisition for WhatsApp. And honestly, you can talk to most economists, and they will tell you that with the lens of traditional economics, those numbers do not make sense. Right? You can justify it by the user base, all that stuff, but at the end of the day, WhatsApp had some revenue, but WhatsApp was not a profitable company. And paying $20 billion for non-profitable company, it has to have very interesting ROI for you to justify that to your stakeholders, right? So it was not about just the user base and the profitability. I think what it was about was Facebook knew what was going on. Facebook knew that these companies are trying to unbundle Facebook. And Facebook paid this huge premium to purchase these companies because they refused to be the next AOL. They refused to be the next Yahoo. And they refused to be put in the position that they had put Facebook, Google in just several years before that, right? They stopped the unbundling that was being done to them. That's why they acquired these companies. And the reason I believe this, another evidence we have that this is exactly what was going on, is what happened once Facebook actually purchased these companies, right? Facebook buys companies all the time. If I were to guess, they probably buy a company every week, if not every day. But every time Facebook buys companies, it's like acqui-hire, right? They either just buy the talent that is in these companies and don't care about the product, shut down the product, or they roll in the product into the main Facebook offering. This is absolutely not what happened with Instagram or WhatsApp. It's been a couple of years already since the acquisitions, right? And they had made zero efforts in trying to merge either Instagram or WhatsApp into Facebook. These companies are running almost as they were running before Facebook acquisition. Why? I don't think it's because the founders of these companies were such skilled negotiators that they negotiated those terms with Mark Zuckerberg. I don't think that's what's going on. I think what's going on is that because Facebook acquired them to stop unbundling, they know that if they kill these products or they integrate these products into the main Facebook offering, then they will stop the unbundling. And then there will be another company that will try to unbundle those features from the Facebook. They don't want to do that. They actually want these companies to try the effort of unbundling Facebook, right? Facebook still has image sharing. Facebook still has chat, which is just Facebook stuff. And these companies are still unbundling those things from Facebook. And Facebook is healthily competing with its own self in a way. But what is going to happen is if these companies win, and if they are successful in unbundling Facebook, then their success is still part of the Facebook family because it's owned by Facebook. Right? They don't want to kill this process. They just want to be in control of the process. Now, how is this in any way, shape, or form relevant to APIs? Right? Hopefully it was an interesting story, right? How many of you found it an interesting story? Thank you. So, but how is this interesting story relevant to APIs? It is relevant to APIs because if you look at your business, the most unbundled form of your business, like if you want to start unbundling and doing these things to yourself so that others don't unbundle you, the most unbundled form of your business is APIs. Right? Now, imagine that you are the founder of Instagram back in the day, right? How many of you use Instagram? A few of you. I don't love it, right? So I'm not judging people who are not using Instagram. But what Instagram does, basically, those of you who do use Instagram, if I misrepresent, feel free to correct me. But I think in my mind, what Instagram is, the great thing about Instagram was the filters, right? So they let you turn your boring, everyday photos into something exciting by providing this awesome filters that they designed, right? So filters was the value added. Image sharing was nothing new, and comments to image sharing was also nothing new. Filters was the innovation there, right? But if you're a founder of Instagram and you're doing something like that, you want to concentrate on your core competency, right? You want to concentrate on the filters. At the same time, you still have to develop very large infrastructure that hosts these billions of photos reliably, because if I lose like the photos of major events of my life, I'm going to be very pissed at Instagram, right? So you still need to develop this very non-trivial infrastructure to host all these photos reliably and serve them scalably and speedily, but that's not your value added. That's just something you have to do. Your value added is filters. And Facebook already had all that infrastructure, and I would argue probably one of the most scalable in the world. So imagine if Facebook had an API. Facebook has many APIs, but that was not one of the API Facebook offered. Imagine if Facebook had an API that Instagram could have used to just take care of all of that scalability and storage, which would allow this mobile application company to only spend their time on the filters and other stuff. I think it's easy to argue that they would have done that. They would have used that API. And as soon as they use your API, the whole equation completely changes, right? Then they are not unbundling you. What they are doing is they are growing their business on your platform. And Facebook is the master of managing that, right? They have let many, many companies be created on the Facebook platform that made billions of dollars on Facebook platform. That is, Facebook never acquired Zynga, for instance, right? That is not what is threatening them. That is not unbundling for them. If it's part of the ecosystem, they know how to benefit from it, right? So if Facebook had pre-unbundled themselves in this specific images part, maybe they would not have to spend $1 billion to then acquire Instagram, because then it would not have been unbundling, right? Just a thought. And it's not also just about any type of API, but microservices very specifically are the best fit of this unbundling thing if you're buying into it, right? Because one of the things for some of you that may be familiar with microservices, one of the big things about microservices is that, well, microservices are obviously APIs, right? They're a group of APIs, but they are designed with a very specific approach, which is they are designed around business capabilities, right? Not around your technical needs or not around what is the most efficient architecturally, but they are designed around business capabilities. And it appears that if you're going to unbundle your business, it's the best way to unbundle that is across the seams of the business capabilities, right? So of all the ways to unbundle your business through APIs, microservices are the best fitting way of doing it. So microservices are a very efficient way of unbundling your business. And this is important because if you remember the whole evolution of species and Charles Darwin, one of the things that Darwin said was the species that survived, whether you actually believe in the evolution history or not, by the way, right? Because I'm not going to get into that argument. But regardless, it's very interesting that he said the species that survived were not the smartest or the strongest. Right? You would assume that if it's the competition, it would be the smartest or the strongest. But no, the species that survived were the most adaptable. Right? So if you build a successful business, or if you are a successful business today, it's guaranteed that somebody will try to disrupt you. It's guaranteed that somebody will try to unbundle you. You have no control of not making them not want to do that. The only way to make nobody want to disrupt you is to be very unsuccessful, right? But if you are successful, somebody will try to unbundle you. So the only question remaining is, will you have to react or will you be ready for it? If you understand this, if you use APIs and microservices efficiently to prepare yourself for being unbundled, you will be ahead of your competition. You will be ahead of the curve of evolution. And that really is the three most important lessons I wanted to share with you today. Number one, APIs are products. They're not just the access point to your data. API governance should be mostly decentralized. You still can have some control over certain parts, but most of it should be treated as a marketplace. And microservices is a very efficient way to unbundle your business in preparation for the competition. Thank you very much.